Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 when she killed 2 people, but sitting in that courtroom, you'd never know it. She looked relaxed, almost confident, like someone waiting for good news, not a murder verdict. Her story was simple. She couldn't remember. Brain injury, blackout, a terrible accident. And for over a year, that story held. No witnesses lived to tell another version. No evidence proved otherwise. She thought she was untouchable. Then the lights dimmed, a screen lit up, and 19 seconds of silent footage began to play. What the courtroom saw next made grown men gasp, made mothers cover their mouths, and made Mackenzie realize something terrifying. The car had been recording everything. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, I'd subscribe now and tell us what you think below. This is how it all began. July 31st, 2022, 5:30 in the morning. A silver Toyota Camry rolled down an empty road in Strongsville, Ohio. Inside were 3 people. Dominic Russo, 20, Davian Flanagan, 19. And behind the wheel, Mackenzie Shirilla. She was just 17. The road was deserted, brick buildings, empty parking lots, one surveillance camera on a corner that nobody knew was working. What happened next took less than 2 minutes, but it destroyed 3 families forever. Because this wasn't a crash, it wasn't reckless driving, it was something colder, something calculated. The only reason we know the truth is because of that camera, and because of a tiny black box hidden in the car that recorded every choice she made. The speed, the steering. The moment she stopped pretending and showed the world exactly who she really was. The courtroom was freezing. That's what people remember most about that day. The air conditioning running full blast, making everyone shift in their seats, pulling jackets tighter. August 14th, 2023. Over a year since the crash, and finally, the day Mackenzie Shirilla would learn her fate. The room was packed, every seat taken. Reporters lined the back wall with cameras and notebooks. Dominic's family sat on one side, clutching tissues and photographs. Davian's family sat nearby, faces hard with grief and anger. And at the defense table, in a neat blouse and slacks, sat Mackenzie. Her hair was styled, her posture straight. She leaned over to whisper something to her attorney, and for just a second, the corner of her mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, but close enough. She didn't look like someone on trial for murder. She looked like someone who thought they'd already won. Her foot tapped lightly under the table, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. But it wasn't the frantic tapping of fear. It was the impatient rhythm of someone counting down minutes until freedom. She adjusted the bracelet on her wrist, glanced at the clock, looked toward the door like she was already picturing herself walking through it. Her mother sat in the gallery, eyes red but hopeful. Her father stared straight ahead, jaw tight. They had spent the last year insisting their daughter was innocent, that this was a tragic accident, that Mackenzie was a victim too. And sitting there, watching her calm demeanor, you could almost believe them. But across the aisle, the families of the dead saw something else. And they saw the girl who had taken their sons, the girl who sat through hearing after hearing with barely a tear, the girl who, during one pretrial session, had been caught smiling at a supporter in the gallery. Dominic's mother would never forget that moment. The way Mackenzie's face lit up for just a second, like she'd forgotten where she was. Like this was all just an inconvenience she'd soon move past. It made her sick. It made her furious. And it made her wonder, does this girl even understand what she's done? Or does she truly believe she's about to go home? Judge Nancy Margaret Russo sat at the bench, stone-faced and silent. She had presided over this case from the beginning, watching every piece of evidence, hearing every argument. She was known for being fair but firm, thoughtful but unshakable. And today, she held Mackenzie's entire future in her hands. The prosecutor rose from his seat, a stack of papers in one hand, a small remote control in the other. He cleared his throat, addressed the court, and said that, before any further statements, he wanted to present critical evidence one final time. The surveillance footage, the black box data, the forensic reconstruction. He wanted the court to see, beyond any doubt, what had really happened that morning on Alameda Drive. Mackenzie's lawyer objected, argued that the evidence had already been presented multiple times, that showing it again was only meant to inflame emotions and prejudice the court. But Judge Russo overruled. She said the evidence was central to the case and that she would view it as many times as necessary to reach a just verdict. The prosecutor nodded, pressed a button, and the lights in the courtroom dimmed. Monitors flickered to life on the walls. A timestamp appeared. July 31st, 2022, 5:30 a.m. The room fell silent. Even the air conditioning seemed quiet. All eyes turned to the screens, and Mackenzie, for the first time that day, stopped tapping her foot. The footage was grainy but clear enough. A wide shot of an empty industrial road, brick warehouses on both sides, a chain-link fence, no cars, no people, just the pale gray light of early morning. Then, from the left side of the frame, a silver Toyota Camry appeared. It moved slowly at first, creeping down the road like someone looking for an address. It reached the end of the street, paused, and then turned around. The car circled back, positioned itself at the top of the road, and then, suddenly, it accelerated. Fast. Faster. But the tires didn't screech. The brake lights never flashed. The car just launched itself forward, gaining speed with every second, heading straight toward a solid brick wall at the end of the block. The courtroom watched in horror. Some people leaned forward. Others turned away. Dominic's mother buried her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Davian's family stared at the screen, tears streaming down their faces. And then the impact. The car slammed into the wall with a force that made the building shudder. Metal crumpled. Glass exploded. The front end of the Camry folded like paper. The screen froze on that image. The mangled wreckage, smoke rising, the wall cracked and dented. The room was silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And when the lights slowly came back on, and every person in that courtroom had the same thought. That was no accident. Mackenzie sat frozen. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. Her jaw was clenched, her breathing shallow. The confident, almost bored expression she'd worn all morning was gone. In its place was something raw, something close to panic. Her lawyer leaned over, whispered something, but she didn't respond. She just stared straight ahead, blinking rapidly, as if trying to erase what everyone had just seen. But it was too late. The video had spoken. The black box had spoken. And now the only question left was whether Mackenzie Shirilla would finally tell the truth, or if the evidence would have to do it for her. Strongsville, Ohio, isn't the kind of place where you expect tragedy. It's a suburb, quiet, safe, and the kind of town where people leave their garage doors open and kids ride bikes until the streetlights come on. Located just outside Cleveland, it's filled with chain restaurants, strip malls, and neighborhoods where everyone knows everyone. The high school football games draw crowds. The local coffee shop knows your order by heart. It's the American dream in miniature, stable, predictable, and comfortable. But in July 2022, that illusion shattered. Because in Strongsville, a 17-year-old girl would do something so violent, so calculated, that the whole town would be forced to ask a question they'd never considered before. How well do we really know the people around us? Dominic Russo was 20 years old and the kind of guy people gravitated toward. He had that rare mix of street smarts and warmth. Tough enough to handle himself, but soft enough to care deeply about the people he loved. He was fiercely loyal to his family, especially his mother. Friends described him as the guy who'd give you the shirt off his back, the one who'd show up at 2 a.m. if you needed him. He wasn't perfect. He had his rough edges. He'd been in trouble before, small stuff, the kind of mistakes young men make when they're figuring out who they are. But to those who knew him best, Dominic was golden. He had dreams. He had plans. And he had a girlfriend named Mackenzie who seemed to consume more and more of his world. Davian Flanagan, 19, was Dominic's best friend. Where Dominic was intense, Davian was laid back. He had a quick smile and an easy laugh. He was the kind of friend who kept the peace, who lightened the mood when things got heavy. He wasn't part of the drama between Dominic and Mackenzie. He wasn't involved in their fights or their breakups. He was just a guy trying to enjoy life, hang out with his friends, and figure out his future. His family remembers him as kind, thoughtful, the type of son who called home just to check in. He had no reason to be in that car that morning, no reason to be caught in the crossfire of someone else's toxic relationship. But he was, and it would cost him everything. Mackenzie Sherilla was 17, a senior in high school, and to most people, she seemed like just another teenage girl. She was into fashion. She posted selfies on social media. She did TikTok dances and hung out with friends at the mall. Her Instagram was full of filtered photos, bright smiles, and captions about living your best life. To classmates, she wasn't a villain. She wasn't scary or strange. She was just Mackenzie. A little dramatic, sure. A little intense when it came to relationships. But nothing that stood out as dangerous. Her online persona was carefully curated, like most teenagers. She wanted to be seen as confident, fun, and loved. And for a while, that's exactly how people saw her. But beneath the surface, something darker was brewing. Mackenzie and Dominic met the way most young couples do, through mutual friends, at parties, around town. At first, it seemed like a typical high school relationship. Late-night phone calls, rides around town with the windows down and music blaring, cute photos posted online with heart emojis. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Friends started noticing the fights, the screaming matches, the dramatic breakups that never really stuck. Mackenzie would post something cryptic on social media, hinting at a breakup, and then delete it a few hours later. Dominic would tell friends it was over, and then they'd be back together by the weekend. It became a pattern, a cycle, and with each turn of that cycle, things seemed to get more volatile. The fights were loud, public. Friends described hearing them argue over the phone, voices raised, accusations flying. They fought about loyalty, about trust, about who Dominic was texting or where he'd been. Mackenzie was possessive. She wanted to know where he was at all times, who he was with, what he was doing. And when she didn't get the answers she wanted, things escalated. There were reports of phones being smashed, doors being slammed, on social media posts that hinted at something much darker than normal teenage drama. One friend would later testify that Mackenzie had once said she'd crash her car to end it all. At the time, people dismissed it. Teenagers say dramatic things. They don't mean them. But looking back, those words felt like a warning no one took seriously enough. To the adults around them, it all looked like typical young love chaos. Parents saw pieces of it, but not the whole picture. Teachers noticed mood swings, but chalked it up to teenage hormones. Neighbors saw them together in the car late at night, music loud, sometimes arguing, but it never seemed serious enough to intervene. In a town like Strongsville, you assume the best. You assume kids will figure it out. You assume that drama is just drama, not a countdown to something deadly. But assumptions, as this case would prove, can be fatal. Because while everyone was dismissing the red flags as normal teenage behavior, Mackenzie and Dominic's relationship was becoming a powder keg. And by the summer of 2022, all it needed was a spark. The car became their world. It was where they talked, where they fought, where they made up and broke up and made up again. Friends remember seeing them in that silver Toyota Camry constantly, driving around Strongsville with nowhere to go and nothing to do but circle the same streets over and over. It became a symbol of their relationship, contained, repetitive, and increasingly dangerous. The car was freedom. The car was control. And eventually, the car would become a weapon. By late July, People close to them would later say they felt something coming. They couldn't name it. Couldn't point to one specific moment, but there was a feeling, a tension, like watching storm clouds gather on the horizon. And on the morning of July 31st, that storm finally broke. The last weeks of July 2022 were brutal. The fights between Mackenzie and Dominic reached a new level of intensity. Text messages flew back and forth, filled with accusations, threats, and desperate pleas. Friends who saw the messages later described them as toxic, obsessive. The kind of communication that doesn't come from love, but from something much darker: control, fear, and rage. Mackenzie was furious with Dominic. She felt like he wasn't committed, like he was pulling away, like he didn't care about her the way she cared about him, and that feeling, that perceived rejection, seemed to consume her. She couldn't let it go, couldn't walk away. So she needed him to understand, to feel what she was feeling, to pay attention. During one argument witnessed by a friend, Mackenzie reportedly said something chilling. She would crash the car to end it all. She said it in the heat of the moment, voice shaking with emotion, tears streaming down her face. At the time, the friend didn't know what to do. Was it a serious threat, or just the kind of dramatic thing people say when they're hurting? The friend later admitted feeling deeply uncomfortable but unsure how to intervene. After all, teenagers say extreme things all the time. They threaten to run away, to drop out, to disappear. Most of the time, it's just words. But in Mackenzie's case, those words would become a haunting preview of exactly what was about to happen. July 31st, 2022 began in darkness. At around 5:30 in the morning, most of Strongsville was still asleep. The streets were empty. The sky was just starting to lighten at the edges. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of morning where nothing bad is supposed to happen. But somewhere in that silence, 3 young people were awake. Mackenzie was behind the wheel of her silver Toyota Camry. Dominic sat in the passenger seat beside her, and Davian, loyal and unsuspecting, sat in the back. No one knows exactly what was said in that car. No one knows what led them to that industrial road at that hour. But what is known is this: Mackenzie was driving, and she was heading somewhere very specific. Alameda Drive is not a residential street. It's industrial, isolated, lined with brick warehouses and empty lots. At 5:30 in the morning, there's no traffic, no pedestrians. No reason for a teenage girl to be there unless she's looking for something or planning something. The Camry entered the street slowly, almost cautiously. Surveillance footage from a nearby business captured the car moving down the road, as if scoping it out. It reached the end of the block, where a solid brick wall marked the boundary of a warehouse. The car paused, then turned around, and drove back up the street. It was a strange pattern, deliberate, like someone testing the distance, checking the sight lines, making sure. Then the car stopped at the top of the road. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The engine idled. The headlights pointed straight down Alameda Drive toward that brick wall at the far end. Inside the car, Dominic and Davian had no idea what was about to happen. They trusted Mackenzie. And they had gotten into the car willingly. They had no reason to think this morning would be their last. And then, without warning, the car lurched forward. The accelerator went down, hard. The Camry shot down the street, gaining speed with terrifying velocity. 20 miles per hour, 40, 60, 80. The numbers climbed, and there was no slowing down, no hesitation, no brake lights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. At nearly 100 miles per hour, the Camry slammed into the brick wall. The impact was catastrophic. The front end of the car crumpled instantly, folding in on itself like an accordion. The brick wall shuddered, chunks of mortar and stone exploding outward. Metal shrieked, glass shattered. The sound echoed through the empty industrial park, a violent punctuation mark in the morning silence. Inside the car, Dominic and Davian were killed almost instantly. The force of the crash was simply too great. Their bodies absorbed the brutal physics of a head-on collision at highway speed. There was no time to brace, no time to scream, no time to understand what was happening. One moment, they were alive. The next, they were gone. Emergency alarms triggered automatically. Security systems at nearby businesses registered the impact. Within minutes, 911 calls started coming in. Early morning workers arriving at warehouses saw the wreckage and ran to help. Firefighters and police were dispatched immediately. As they raced toward Alameda Drive, they had no idea what they were about to find. The initial call described it as a single-vehicle crash, possibly high speed, with multiple occupants. It sounded like a tragic accident. A case of reckless teenage driving gone horribly wrong. But as first responders arrived on scene and began pulling apart the wreckage, they started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Things that would turn this from a crash investigation into a homicide case. The first responders worked quickly. The car was destroyed, twisted metal, and shattered glass everywhere. They fought to reach the occupants, using tools to pry open doors and cut through the wreckage. Dominic was found in the front passenger seat, injuries consistent with a massive frontal impact. Davian was in the back, his body thrown forward by the force of the crash. Both were unresponsive. Paramedics checked for vital signs, hoping for a miracle, but there was none to be found. They were pronounced dead at the scene. And then, in the driver's seat, rescuers found her. Mackenzie Sharilla, 17 years old, pinned by the wreckage but alive. Breathing, conscious enough to moan in pain. She was the only survivor. And that fact, more than anything else, would become the center of a storm no one saw coming. The scene was chaos, twisted metal, shattered glass, the smell of gasoline and burnt rubber hanging in the air. The silver Toyota Camry was barely recognizable, its front end crushed so completely it looked like it had been through a compactor. The brick wall it had hit bore a deep gouge, chunks of mortar and brick scattered across the pavement. Emergency lights flashed red and blue, casting eerie shadows across the industrial buildings. Firefighters moved carefully through the debris, their boots crunching on glass, their voices calm but urgent. This was the kind of crash that left scars, not just on the people involved, but on everyone who witnessed the aftermath. Inside the car, the devastation was even worse. Personal items were scattered everywhere, a phone with a cracked screen, a vape pen, a crushed water bottle, a single shoe. These small, ordinary objects created a haunting contrast to the violence that had just occurred. They were reminders that moments before impact, this had been a car full of living, breathing people. People with plans, people with futures. Now those futures were gone. Dominic lay in the front passenger seat, his injuries so severe that even the most experienced paramedics knew instantly there was nothing they could do. Davian, thrown forward from the back seat, was in similar condition. The force of a 100-mile-per-hour crash into an immovable object leaves no room for survival, while the positioning of the bodies told a story. Dominic hadn't tried to grab the wheel. There were no defensive wounds on his hands, no signs that he'd braced himself or attempted to interfere with the driver. Davian, too, showed no indication of having tried to stop what was happening. Both young men appeared to have been caught completely off guard, with no time to react before the impact. That detail would later become critical, because if they didn't see it coming, if they didn't try to stop it, then what did that say about the moments before the crash? What did it say about trust? About betrayal? About the girl behind the wheel who walked away while they did not? Mackenzie was found wedged in the driver's seat, her head pressed against the dashboard, airbag deployed. She was unconscious but breathing. And her vital signs were weak but stable. Paramedics worked quickly to stabilize her neck and spine, carefully extracting her from the wreckage. She had serious injuries, head trauma, broken bones, lacerations, but nothing immediately life-threatening. The disparity was striking. 2 passengers dead, one driver alive. In crashes like this, survival often comes down to positioning, seat belts, and airbag deployment. But to the families watching from behind police tape, it felt like something else. It felt like injustice. How does the person responsible walk away when the innocent don't? Paramedics loaded Mackenzie onto a stretcher and into a waiting helicopter. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her to a trauma center, investigators on the ground began their work. They photographed everything: the angle of the car, the pattern of the debris, the damage to the wall. They measured skid marks, or rather, the absence of them, because one of the first things they noticed was how clean the pavement was. In a typical crash where someone loses control, you see evidence of panic braking, long black streaks where tires locked up and dragged across asphalt. But here, there was nothing. The road surface was undisturbed all the way up to the point of impact. That absence spoke louder than any evidence they could have found. The car itself became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators decided immediately to impound it and conduct a full mechanical inspection. They needed to know if something had malfunctioned, if the brakes had failed, if the accelerator had stuck, if there was any mechanical explanation for why a car would drive straight into a wall at 100 miles per hour without any attempt to stop. They also wanted to access the car's event data recorder, commonly known as a black box. Modern cars are equipped with these devices, which record information in the seconds leading up to a crash: speed, throttle position, brake application, steering angle. It's like an airplane's black box, but for your daily commute. And in this case, it was about to become the most important witness in the entire investigation. Back at the crash site, a senior detective stood staring at the wreckage. He'd been working accidents for over 20 years. He'd seen speed kills. He'd seen drunk driving tragedies. He'd seen mechanical failures and freak weather events. But something about this scene felt different. One, the straight trajectory, the complete lack of braking, the isolated location at dawn. It didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something else, something deliberate. He didn't say it out loud yet, not until they had more evidence. But he made a note in his report, a single line that would eventually change the entire direction of the case. No evidence of evasive action. Recommend full forensic analysis. It was the beginning of a question that would haunt everyone involved. Was this really an accident, or was it murder? As the sun rose over Strongsville, the reality of what had happened began to spread. News crews arrived, setting up cameras and microphones. Neighbors from nearby areas came out, drawn by the flashing lights and police tape. And in 2 separate homes across town, police officers knocked on doors to deliver the worst news any parent can hear. Dominic's mother answered the door in her pajamas, confused at first, then terrified as she saw the officers' faces. Davian's family had the same terrible moment, that split second of denial before reality crashes down. By mid-morning, 3 families were destroyed. 2 were planning funerals, and 1 was praying their daughter would survive. None of them knew yet that survival would bring its own kind of hell. The impounded Camry sat in a secure forensic garage, surrounded by investigators, technicians, and detectives. It looked even worse under the bright fluorescent lights. Every dent, every shattered window, every streak of blood visible in harsh detail. This wasn't just a wrecked car anymore. It was evidence. And buried somewhere inside its crumpled frame was a tiny computer that had recorded everything. The Event Data Recorder, or EDR, is a standard feature in most modern vehicles. It's designed to capture critical data in the seconds before and during a crash. Most people don't even know it exists. But for investigators, it's a goldmine, because unlike human memory, which is fallible and emotional, the black box doesn't lie. It just records facts. A forensic technician connected a specialized diagnostic tool to the car's onboard computer system. The process was delicate, The crash had damaged much of the vehicle's electronics, but the EDR is built to survive impacts. It's housed in a reinforced module specifically designed to withstand the kinds of forces that destroy everything else. After several minutes of troubleshooting, the technician nodded. The data was intact. He downloaded the file onto a laptop and pulled up the report. Rows and columns of numbers filled the screen. Speed, throttle position, brake input, steering angle, seat belt status, airbag deployment. Every measurable action the car had taken in the final seconds before impact was there, time-stamped and precise. The numbers were chilling. In the 5 seconds before impact, the accelerator was pressed to nearly 100%. The car's speed climbed rapidly, 60 miles per hour, 70, 80, 90, and finally topping out around 100 miles per hour at the moment of collision. But it was what didn't happen that told the real story. Brake application, 0. Not even a tap. Not a single moment where the driver's foot moved from the gas to the brake. The steering input showed a straight, consistent trajectory. No swerving, no overcorrection, no sign of a driver fighting to regain control. The data painted a picture of a car being driven with purpose, not panic. It looked less like an accident and more like a missile being guided to its target. Investigators gathered around the laptop, staring at the screen in silence. One detective finally spoke. "This isn't reckless driving. This is intentional." The room absorbed those words. Intentional. It changed everything. Reckless driving is a tragedy, a bad decision with horrible consequences, but intentional? That's murder. The lead investigator made a decision right then. This case needed to be reclassified. It was no longer a vehicular homicide investigation. It was a double murder investigation. And the suspect, now currently recovering in a hospital bed under police guard, was 17-year-old Mackenzie Sherilla. The girl everyone assumed was a victim was now the primary suspect, and the evidence against her was only beginning to pile up. While technicians analyzed the black box, other investigators pulled surveillance footage from every business within a mile of Alameda Drive. Most of the cameras had nothing useful. Wrong angles. Too far away. But one camera, mounted on the corner of a warehouse, had a perfect view of the street. When they reviewed the footage from the morning of July 31st, they saw exactly what the black box had described. A silver Camry entering the frame, moving slowly, turning around, and then accelerating in a straight line toward the wall. The video was silent, grainy, but undeniable. You could see the car gain speed. You could see the headlights grow brighter as it approached. And you could see the moment of impact, a brief flash of destruction before the car disappeared into a cloud of debris and dust. But the investigators didn't stop there. They went back further, reviewing footage from the days leading up to the crash. And that's when they found something that made their blood run cold. On July 29th, 2 days before the crash, the same silver Camry appeared on the same street. The car drove slowly down Alameda Drive, just like it had on the 31st. It reached the brick wall, paused, and then turned around and drove away. It was a test run, a rehearsal. Mackenzie had driven that route before, scoping it out, checking the distance, making sure she knew exactly where the wall was and how much space she had to build up speed. That footage turned the case from suspicious to damning. Because accidents don't require practice runs. At the hospital, Mackenzie was beginning to regain consciousness. She had undergone surgery for her injuries and was now in stable condition, hooked up to monitors and IVs, her head wrapped in bandages. Police officers stood outside her room, waiting for doctors to clear her for questioning. Her family was there too, her mother crying softly in the corner, her father pacing the hallway. They were told that their daughter had been in a terrible accident, that her boyfriend and his friend had died, that she was lucky to be alive. But they weren't told yet that investigators no longer believed it was an accident. They weren't told that their daughter was about to be charged with murder. That conversation was coming. But first, my detectives needed to hear what Mackenzie had to say. Meanwhile, across town, two families were being notified in the most brutal way possible. Dominic's mother was at home when police knocked on her door. She opened it, saw their faces, and immediately knew. She started shaking her head, backing away, saying, "No, no, no," over and over. The officer stepped inside gently, asked her to sit down, and told her that Dominic had been in a crash, that he didn't survive. She screamed, a deep primal sound that came from somewhere beyond words. She begged them to tell her he was in jail instead. Anything but dead, anything but gone. And when they told her Mackenzie had been driving, her grief turned instantly to rage. She had never trusted that girl, never felt safe with her son in that car. And now her worst fears had come true. Dominic was dead, and Mackenzie had walked away. Detectives knew they had something big, but they needed more. The black box data and the crash day surveillance footage were damning, but a good defense attorney could still argue panic, mechanical failure, or a split-second mistake. What they needed was evidence of intent, evidence that this wasn't a moment of madness, but a calculated act. So they kept digging. They pulled more surveillance footage. They interviewed more witnesses. They obtained search warrants for Mackenzie's phone, her social media accounts, and her computer. They built a timeline of her life in the weeks leading up to the crash. And with every piece of evidence they uncovered, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. This wasn't an accident. It was a plan. And Mackenzie had left a trail. Or the footage from July 29th became a key focus. Investigators watched it over and over, analyzing every detail. The way the car moved slowly down Alameda Drive, almost cautiously. The way it stopped at the wall, as if measuring the distance. The way it turned around and left without incident. It was eerily similar to the pattern on July 31st, except this time there was no acceleration, no impact, just observation. Prosecutors would later call it a test run, arguing that Mackenzie had gone to that location specifically to plan the crash. Defense attorneys would counter that it was coincidence, that she'd simply driven down that road before. But when you put the two videos side by side, the similarities were impossible to ignore. Same road, same car, same positioning. The only difference was intent. Digital forensics became the next battleground. When investigators accessed Mackenzie's phone, they found a trove of text messages between her and Dominic. The messages painted a picture of a deeply troubled relationship, arguments about loyalty, accusations of cheating, threats to leave, and from Mackenzie, increasingly desperate pleas for attention and commitment. In one exchange, she told Dominic that if he ever left her, she didn't know what she'd do. In another, she said she couldn't live without him. Friends who were shown the messages described them as obsessive, toxic, the kind of communication that doesn't come from healthy love, but from something much darker: control, dependency, and fear of abandonment. But it was the deleted messages that really caught investigators' attention. Using forensic recovery software, technicians were able to pull up texts that Mackenzie had tried to erase. In one of them, sent just days before the crash, she wrote something chilling. "Maybe I should just crash the car and end it all." The recipient, a friend, had responded with concern, asking if she was okay. Mackenzie replied that she was just venting, that she didn't mean it literally. But now, in the context of what had actually happened, those words took on a horrifying new meaning. They weren't just venting. They were a confession, a preview of exactly what she was planning to do. Friends started coming forward with their own stories. One former classmate testified that Mackenzie had mentioned crashing her car during an argument with Dominic months earlier. At the time, the friend thought it was just dramatic teenager talk. Kids say extreme things when they're upset. But now, looking back, it felt like a warning. Another friend recalled Mackenzie talking about how if Dominic ever left her, she'd make sure he couldn't be with anyone else. It was said half-jokingly, the kind of possessive comment people make without thinking. But combined with everything else, it fit a pattern of threats, a pattern of control, a pattern of someone who saw violence as a solution when she didn't get her way. The car itself underwent a thorough mechanical inspection. Experts examined every system: the brakes, the accelerator, the steering, the electronic controls. They were looking for any evidence of malfunction, any defect that could explain why a car would accelerate uncontrollably into a wall. They found nothing. The brakes were in working order. The accelerator pedal had no defects. The steering column was intact. There were no error codes stored in the car's computer indicating electronic failure. Every system had functioned exactly as designed. The only variable in the equation was the driver, the person pressing the pedal, the person choosing not to brake, the person steering straight toward a brick wall at 100 miles per hour. Crash reconstruction experts built a detailed model of what happened. They used the surveillance footage, the black box data, and measurements from the scene to recreate the Camry's path down Alameda Drive. They calculated the speed at different points. They analyzed the angle of impact. They determined that the car had traveled approximately 600 feet from its starting point to the wall, giving it plenty of space to reach lethal velocity. And they concluded unequivocally that this was not consistent with a driver losing control. A driver losing control swerves, overcorrects, hits the brakes too late, leaves skid marks. This driver had done none of those things. This driver had aimed the car like a weapon and pulled the trigger. With all the evidence compiled, detectives presented their findings to the prosecutor's office. The case file was thick: black box data, surveillance footage, text messages, witness statements, mechanical inspections, and expert analysis. The recommendation was clear: charge Mackenzie Shirilla with 2 counts of murder. Not manslaughter, not reckless homicide, murder. Because the evidence showed that she had acted with purpose and intent. She had planned it. She had tested the route. She had threatened it. And then, on the morning of July 31st, our 2022, she had done it. She had killed Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan. And the only reason she survived was because she was the one in control, the one who knew exactly what was coming. Who is Mackenzie Shirilla? That's the question everyone started asking. On the surface, she seemed like 1,000 other teenage girls. She posted selfies. She went to parties. She cared about her appearance and her social media presence. Her Instagram feed was full of the usual stuff: photos with friends, makeup tutorials, song lyrics as captions. She looked happy. Normal. Just another kid navigating the messy, emotional world of high school. But beneath that curated image was something much more complex, something darker. And as investigators dug deeper into her life, a different picture began to emerge. A picture of a girl who needed control, who couldn't handle rejection, and who, when pushed to her emotional breaking point, was capable of unspeakable violence. Friends described her as intense. When she cared about something or someone, she cared deeply, obsessively even. Her relationship with Dominic consumed her. She wanted to know where he was at all times, who he was talking to, what he was doing. If he didn't respond to her texts fast enough, she'd spiral. She'd call him repeatedly, show up at his house unannounced. Friends noticed that Dominic seemed increasingly exhausted by the relationship. He would talk about breaking up with her, but then she'd cry or threaten to hurt herself, and he'd stay. It was a cycle, a trap. And Davian, loyal friend that he was, tried to help Dominic navigate it, never realizing that his proximity to the situation would cost him his life. And psychologically, experts would later debate what drove Mackenzie to do what she did. Some pointed to signs of narcissism, an inflated sense of self-importance, a need for admiration, and an inability to empathize with others. Her behavior after the crash, Her calm demeanor, her lack of visible remorse, her focus on her own injuries rather than the deaths of Dominic and Davian seemed to support that theory. Others argued she was simply a deeply broken teenager, someone who had never learned healthy ways to process rejection and anger. She was 17. Her brain wasn't fully developed. She was operating on emotion and impulse, not logic and foresight. The debate would rage on, but one thing was clear. Whatever her psychological makeup, she had made a choice. And that choice had ended 2 lives. The threatening language she'd used in the past became a focal point of the investigation. Multiple witnesses confirmed that Mackenzie had, at various times, talked about crashing her car. Sometimes it was framed as self-harm. "I'll just drive off a bridge." Other times it was more ambiguous. "I'll crash the car and end it all." Friends admitted they hadn't taken it seriously. People say things like that when they're upset. They don't actually mean it. But Mackenzie had meant it, or at least she'd meant it enough to follow through. Prosecutors would argue that these statements showed premeditation, that she'd been fantasizing about using her car as a weapon long before July 31st. Defense attorneys would counter that they were cries for help, not credible threats. But the jury of public opinion had already made up its mind. Now, after the crash, Mackenzie's behavior raised even more questions. Body cam footage from the hospital showed her in the back of a police cruiser, staring out the window with a blank expression. At times, she cried softly. At other times, she seemed eerily calm, almost detached. When officers tried to talk to her, she said she couldn't remember what happened, couldn't remember driving, couldn't remember the crash. Just a blank space where those minutes should be. Medical experts confirmed she had suffered a traumatic brain injury, which can cause memory loss. But investigators were skeptical. Convenient memory loss, they called it. Remembering everything except the one moment that mattered, the one moment that would prove her guilt. As the case moved toward trial, Mackenzie's demeanor in court became another source of controversy. She appeared at hearings looking composed, sometimes even bored. She would whisper to her attorneys, adjust her hair, glance around the room. At one early hearing, a camera caught her sharing a brief smile with a family member in the gallery. The moment was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it was captured and shared online. The reaction was swift and brutal. How could she smile? How could she sit there, calm and collected, while 2 families mourned their sons? The public saw coldness, arrogance, a girl who thought she was untouchable. But her defense team saw something else, a traumatized teenager, medicated and in shock, struggling to process a reality too overwhelming to fully comprehend. The debate over Mackenzie's mental state became central to how people viewed the case. Was she a narcissistic sociopath who killed in cold blood? Or was she a broken, mentally ill teenager who snapped under emotional pressure? The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in between. She wasn't a cartoon villain. She wasn't born evil. But she also wasn't just a victim of her own emotions. She made choices. She threatened. She planned. She tested the route. And then she acted. Whether that action came from a place of calculated malice or desperate, irrational emotion, the result was the same. 2 young men were dead. And Mackenzie Sherilla was the reason why. The only question left was whether the law would call it murder, and if so, what price she would pay. The grand jury indictment came down like a hammer. Mackenzie Sherilla was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, multiple counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, and felonious assault. The language in the indictment was stark and unforgiving. The state alleged that she had used her vehicle as a deadly weapon with the purpose of causing the deaths of Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan. This wasn't reckless driving. This wasn't vehicular manslaughter. This was murder. The charges carried the possibility of life in prison. For a 17-year-old girl, that meant spending the rest of her youth, her 20s, her 30s, and possibly the rest of her natural life behind bars. The weight of those charges settled over everyone involved. For the families of the victims, it was a step toward justice. For Mackenzie's family, it was the beginning of a nightmare. Her first major court appearance drew a crowd. Reporters packed the hallway outside the courtroom. Cameras jostled for position. Inside, the benches filled quickly with family members, curious locals, and court regulars who follow high-profile cases. Mackenzie was led in wearing a jail uniform, wrists shackled, flanked by deputies. She looked smaller than she had in her social media photos. Younger, more fragile. Her parents sat in the front row of the gallery, her mother clutching a tissue, her father's jaw clenched tight. When the charges were read aloud, murder, aggravated vehicular homicide, her mother began to cry softly. Mackenzie stood at the defense table, staring straight ahead, face blank. When the judge asked how she pleaded, her attorney answered for her. Not guilty. The defense strategy began to take shape almost immediately. Her lawyers painted a picture of a tragic accident, not a calculated killing. They emphasized Mackenzie's age. She was 17, barely more than a child in the eyes of the law. They talked about her injuries, both physical and psychological. Traumatic brain injury, memory loss, emotional trauma. They suggested alternative explanations for what happened. Maybe she'd blacked out. Maybe the accelerator had stuck. Maybe Dominic had grabbed the wheel in a moment of panic. They threw out possibilities, seeds of doubt designed to make the jury, or in this case the judge, question whether the state could really prove intent beyond a reasonable doubt. It was a classic defense playbook. Admit the tragedy, but deny the intent. Prosecutors, meanwhile, came out swinging. They laid out their case in stark, simple terms. Mackenzie Shirilla had turned her car into a weapon and used it to kill. They previewed the black box data, the surveillance footage, the test run, and the threatening statements she'd made to friends. They described her possessive, controlling behavior in the relationship. They painted a picture of a girl who, when faced with the possibility of losing Dominic, decided that if she couldn't have him, no one would. And Davian? He was collateral damage, an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire of someone else's rage. The prosecution's message was clear. This case wasn't about a confused teenager making a mistake. It was about murder, cold, calculated, and caught on camera. The courtroom became a theater of micro-expressions and body language. Every time Mackenzie appeared, observers watched her closely. How did she react when the victims' names were mentioned? Did she cry? Did she look down? Did she show any sign of remorse? The answers varied depending on who you asked. Or her supporters saw a traumatized girl struggling to hold herself together. Her detractors saw a cold, manipulative actress putting on a performance. At one hearing, she appeared to share a quiet laugh with someone at the defense table. It lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it was enough. The moment was captured, screenshot, and spread across social media. "She's laughing while 2 families grieve," the comments read. The court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. Guilty. One of the most significant decisions in the case came when Mackenzie's defense team waived her right to a jury trial. Instead, they opted for a bench trial, meaning a single judge would decide her fate. The judge assigned to the case was Nancy Margaret Russo, a seasoned jurist known for her no-nonsense approach and careful attention to detail. And the decision to go with a bench trial was strategic. Juries are unpredictable. They can be swayed by emotion, by a sympathetic defendant, or by a charismatic attorney. A judge, on the other hand, is bound by the law and the evidence. The defense likely hoped that Judge Russo would focus on the legal technicalities and the burden of proof rather than getting caught up in the emotional weight of 2 dead teenagers. Prosecutors, confident in their evidence, accepted the decision. They believed the facts would speak for themselves, no matter who was listening. As the trial date approached, both sides prepared for battle. The prosecution assembled a mountain of evidence: surveillance footage, black box data, text messages, witness testimony, and expert analysis. They built timelines, created visual aids, and rehearsed their arguments. They wanted to leave no room for doubt. The defense, meanwhile, focused on poking holes. They lined up their own experts to challenge the black box interpretation. They prepared to argue that memory loss and brain trauma made it impossible to prove what Mackenzie was thinking in those final seconds. They emphasized her youth, her lack of criminal history, and the tragedy that had already befallen her. Both sides knew that this case would come down to one question. Did Mackenzie Shirilla intend to kill Dominic and Davian, or was this a terrible, tragic accident? The answer would determine whether she walked free or spent the rest of her life in prison. The families of Dominic and Davian prepared themselves emotionally for what was to come. They gathered photos and memories, wrote victim impact statements, and steeled themselves to sit in a courtroom just feet away from the person they believed had murdered their sons. Dominic's mother kept a photo of him in her purse, touching it like a talisman every time she entered the courthouse. Davian's family wore shirts with his face printed on them, a silent reminder to everyone in the room of the real human cost of this case. They weren't just names on a court document. They were sons, brothers, friends, and they deserved justice. As the courthouse doors opened on the first day of trial, everyone involved knew they were about to witness something rare and terrible. A legal system attempting to answer an impossible question. Can you prove what someone was thinking in the seconds before a crash? Can you look into a teenager's heart and find murder? The trial was about to find out. The first day of trial felt like the entire community was holding its breath. The courtroom filled early, every seat claimed, a line of people waiting outside, hoping for a spot inside. Reporters set up in the designated press area, laptops open, ready to live tweet every development. The families of Dominic and Davian sat directly behind the prosecution table, a wall of grief and determination. Across the aisle, Mackenzie's family sat in quiet anguish, her mother's eyes red and swollen, her father's face a mask of controlled emotion. And at the defense table, looking impossibly young in civilian clothes carefully chosen to soften her image, sat Mackenzie Shirilla. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo entered, and the room rose as one. This was it, the moment that would decide whether Mackenzie was a murderer or a victim of tragic circumstances. The prosecution's opening statement was methodical and devastating. The lead prosecutor stood, buttoned his jacket, and addressed Judge Russo directly. He spoke in calm, measured tones, laying out the timeline of events with precision. He described the test run on July 29th, the threatening statements Mackenzie had made to friends, the black box data showing full acceleration and zero braking, the surveillance footage capturing the car's straight, unwavering path toward the brick wall. He emphasized that this case wasn't about what Mackenzie said or claimed to remember. It was about what she did. Your Honor, he said, the evidence will show that on the morning of July 31, 2022, the defendant made a choice. She chose to accelerate. She chose not to brake. She chose to end 2 lives. That's not an accident. That's murder. The defense's opening statement took a completely different tone. Mackenzie's attorney stood and spoke with emotion, asking the court to see the human being behind the charges. She's 17, he reminded the judge. A child, really, caught in an unimaginably tragic situation. He talked about her brain injuries, her memory loss, the psychological trauma of surviving a crash that killed 2 people she cared about. He floated alternative explanations. Maybe she'd had a medical episode. Maybe the pedal stuck. Maybe Dominic, in a moment of panic or anger, had interfered with her driving. Your Honor, he said, the state wants you to believe this was a calculated, cold-blooded killing. But what if it was just a terrible, tragic accident? What if this young girl is as much a victim as anyone else? It was a risky strategy, but it was all they had. Mackenzie's demeanor throughout the opening statements was closely watched. She sat with her hands folded on the table, occasionally glancing up at the judge, but mostly staring down at a notepad in front of her. When the prosecutor described the moment of impact, her eyes welled up with tears. When her own attorney spoke about her injuries and trauma, she wiped her face with a tissue. But observers couldn't agree on whether the emotion was genuine. Was she crying for Dominic and Davian, the 2 lives lost? Or was she crying for herself, for the prison sentence looming over her? The families of the victims watched her with hard, unforgiving eyes. They had no sympathy left, not for her tears, not for her excuses, not for anything. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were first responders. Firefighters and police officers who had been at the scene described what they found: the mangled car, the horrific injuries, the desperate attempts to save lives that were already gone. Body cam footage was played, and the courtroom heard the chaos of that morning: the urgent voices, the clatter of equipment, the terrible realization that 2 people were beyond help. One firefighter testified that in his 20 years on the job, he'd never seen a crash that looked quite like this. No skid marks, no evidence of braking. "It was like the car was aimed," he said. That word, aimed, hung in the air like smoke. The defense objected, arguing it was speculation, but the damage was done. The image was planted. Judge Russo maintained strict control over the proceedings. She sustained objections quickly and overruled them just as fast. She asked clarifying questions when testimony got confusing. She reminded both sides to stick to the facts and avoid theatrics. Her presence was commanding but fair. She took extensive notes, occasionally glancing up to study a witness's face as they spoke. It was clear she was absorbing every detail, weighing every word. For those watching, it was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because justice seemed to be in capable hands. Terrifying because everything hinged on one person's interpretation of the evidence. There would be no jury to sway with emotion, no panel of 12 to deliberate and compromise. Just Judge Russo, the evidence, and the law. As the first day drew to a close, the prosecution signaled that their next witnesses would be the technical experts, the crash reconstructionist, the black box analyst, of the people who could translate data and physics into a narrative of intent. The defense knew this was the heart of the state's case. If they could undermine the technical evidence, cast doubt on the black box data or the surveillance footage, they might have a chance. But if that evidence held up under scrutiny, if it proved as damning as the prosecution claimed, then Mackenzie Shirilla's fate was all but sealed. Court adjourned for the day, and as the families filed out, the weight of what was to come settled over everyone like a heavy fog. The truth was about to be told, and there would be no escaping it. The crash reconstruction expert took the stand on day 2 of the trial, and the courtroom immediately felt the shift in tone. This wasn't about emotions or interpretations. This was about physics, facts, numbers that don't lie. The expert, a man with 30 years of experience analyzing vehicle crashes, walked the court through his findings with clinical precision. He used diagrams, animations, and photographs to illustrate the path of the Camry down Alameda Drive. He explained how he calculated the speed based on the length of the road, the damage to the vehicle, and the deformation of the brick wall. He pointed to the absence of skid marks, the straight trajectory, and the lack of any steering correction. His conclusion was unequivocal. This crash was not consistent with a driver who lost control. It was consistent with a driver who maintained control all the way to impact. The black box expert followed, and if anything, his testimony was even more damaging. He explained how event data recorders work, how they capture information in real time, and how reliable that data is. He walked through the specific numbers from Mackenzie's Camry. Throttle position at 98% in the final seconds. Speed climbing steadily from 0 to nearly 100 miles per hour. Brake application, 0, not a single touch, not even a moment of hesitation. He showed the court a graph, speed over time, A smooth upward curve with no dips, no plateaus, nothing to suggest the driver ever tried to stop. The visual was stark, undeniable. The car had been driven like a missile, aimed and launched with precision. The defense tried to push back during cross-examination. Couldn't the data be wrong? Couldn't there have been a malfunction that the black box didn't register? The expert calmly explained that while no system is 100% perfect, EDRs are extraordinarily reliable. They're tested rigorously. They're used in crash investigations nationwide, and in this case, the data was corroborated by physical evidence. The lack of skid marks, the straight trajectory, the surveillance footage. Everything lined up. The defense asked about the possibility of sudden unintended acceleration, a phenomenon where a car accelerates on its own despite the driver's input. The expert acknowledged it's a rare event, but pointed out there was no evidence of it here. No error codes in the car's computer. No recalls for this model. No mechanical defects found. The only explanation left was driver input. Someone pressed that pedal. And that someone was Mackenzie Shirilla. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, the surveillance footage synchronized with the black box data. The prosecution played the video on large monitors positioned so everyone in the courtroom could see. The timestamp appeared in the corner. The black box numbers scrolled on the side of the screen: speed, throttle, brake status. The courtroom watched in silence as the silver Camry appeared in the frame, moving slowly at first. Then, at the top of the road, it stopped. A pause. And then the numbers started climbing. 10 miles per hour, 20, 40, 60, 80. The car grew larger in the frame, headlights bright, accelerating relentlessly toward the brick wall. And the brake status never changed. 0. Not once. Not even at the last second. The impact, when it came, was brutal even in silent, grainy surveillance footage. The screen froze on the image of the destroyed car, smoke rising, the wall cracked and gouged. The courtroom was silent. You could hear people breathing. Someone in the gallery sniffled, trying to hold back tears. Dominic's mother turned away, unable to watch. Davian's family stared at the screen, faces etched with pain. And Mackenzie sat at the defense table, tears streaming down her face, shoulders shaking. Whether those tears were for the victims or for herself, no one could say. But the video had done its job. It had shown, beyond any shadow of doubt, what had happened that morning. And it had made it impossible to call it an accident. The footage was clinical, factual, devoid of emotion. And somehow, that made it even more powerful. Because it didn't need emotion. It didn't need a narrator. It just needed to show the truth. And the truth was undeniable. The defense tried to recover. They called their own experts to the stand, individuals who questioned the interpretation of the data. They suggested that panic could cause someone to press the accelerator instead of the brake. They raised the possibility of a seizure or blackout that left Mackenzie's foot locked on the pedal. They emphasized her traumatic brain injury and memory loss, arguing that she genuinely couldn't explain what happened because she didn't remember it. But every alternative explanation felt thinner and more desperate under the weight of the actual evidence. The prosecution countered each theory with facts. No medical history of seizures. No evidence of pedal misapplication patterns that would show confusion. No indication that she'd lost consciousness before the crash. Just a car driven with purpose toward a brick wall. The test run video was introduced next, and it hit just as hard. The prosecution showed the footage from July 29th, 2 days before the fatal crash. The same road, the same car, the same slow, deliberate drive down Alameda Drive, the same pause at the brick wall. The only difference, this time, the car turned around and left. The prosecutor argued this was proof of planning. She went there to scope it out, to see how much space she had, to make sure she knew exactly where the wall was and how fast she'd need to go. The defense objected, calling it speculation. Judge Russo allowed the evidence, noting that it was relevant to the question of intent. And with that, the final piece of the prosecution's case fell into place. It wasn't just the crash itself, it was the preparation, the threats, the pattern of behavior that all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Mackenzie Shirilla had planned this. And on July 31, 2022, she'd carried it out. As the technical testimony wrapped up, the prosecution prepared to shift gears. They'd proven the how. Now they needed to prove the why. And for that, they needed to take the court inside Mackenzie's mind, into the toxic relationship that had set all of this in motion. The next phase of the trial would be about motive, about jealousy, control, and the deadly collision of teenage emotion and a 3,000-pound weapon. The defense braced themselves, because if the black box was damning, what was coming next would be even worse. The words, the threats, the promises of violence that had been dismissed as drama until they became reality. Mackenzie's own voice, I preserved in text messages and witness statements, was about to testify against her, and there would be no explaining it away. The courtroom atmosphere shifted when the prosecution began calling friends and acquaintances to testify about Mackenzie's behavior in the weeks and months before the crash. These weren't forensic experts or first responders. These were teenagers, young people who had known Mackenzie, hung out with her, seen her at her best and her worst. They looked nervous on the stand, some of them clearly uncomfortable with having to testify against someone they once considered a friend. But one by one, they told their stories. And those stories painted a disturbing picture of a relationship spiraling out of control, and a girl who had been warning everyone what she was capable of, if only they'd listened. The first friend to testify, a young woman who had known Mackenzie since middle school, spoke quietly but clearly. She described an argument she'd witnessed between Mackenzie and Dominic outside a party. They'd been screaming at each other, Mackenzie accusing Dominic of talking to another girl, Dominic insisting he'd done nothing wrong. The fight had gotten so intense that someone threatened to call the police. But what stuck with the witness most was what Mackenzie had said as she got into her car that night. One day I'm going to crash this car with both of us in it, and then you'll be sorry. The friend admitted she hadn't taken it seriously at the time. People say things when they're angry. But now, sitting in that courtroom, knowing what had happened, the memory made her sick. Another witness, a classmate of Mackenzie's, he testified about a conversation they'd had in the school cafeteria just weeks before the crash. Mackenzie had been venting about Dominic, saying she felt like he was pulling away, that he didn't love her anymore. She'd said she couldn't live without him, that if he ever left her for real, she didn't know what she'd do. The classmate had tried to comfort her, told her there were other guys, that she was young and had her whole life ahead of her. But Mackenzie had just shaken her head and said, "You don't understand. If I can't have him, no one can." At the time, it sounded like the kind of melodramatic thing teenagers say. But in hindsight, it sounded like a threat, a promise, a preview of exactly what she would eventually do. The text messages were perhaps the most damaging evidence of all. The prosecution displayed them on the courtroom monitors, scrolling through exchanges between Mackenzie and Dominic, between Mackenzie and her friends. The messages showed obsession, desperation, a girl who could not let go. In one exchange, Mackenzie sent Dominic over 50 messages in a single hour, demanding to know where he was and who he was with. When he didn't respond fast enough, she threatened to hurt herself. In another conversation, she told a friend that she fantasized about crashing her car so Dominic would finally understand how much pain he was causing her. The messages were raw, unfiltered glimpses into a mind unraveling, and they made it impossible to see the crash as a spontaneous act of panic. This had been building for a long time. The defense tried to reframe the testimony and messages as the words of a troubled, mentally ill teenager, not a premeditated killer. They argued that young people, especially those in toxic relationships, often say extreme things they don't mean. that emotional outbursts and dark humor are coping mechanisms, not literal plans. They brought up Mackenzie's age, her lack of emotional maturity, the fact that her brain wasn't fully developed. They suggested that she was crying out for help, not plotting murder. But the prosecution countered with a simple question. At what point do words stop being cries for help and start being confessions? At what point does a threat become a plan? And when that plan is carried out, when two people are dead, and the person who threatened it is the one behind the wheel, how can you call it anything but murder? And medical experts for the defense took the stand to discuss Mackenzie's traumatic brain injury and its effects on memory and cognition. They explained that the crash had caused significant head trauma, which could result in retrograde amnesia, an inability to recall events immediately before the injury. They testified that it was entirely possible Mackenzie genuinely couldn't remember what happened in those final seconds. That her brain had essentially shut down, protecting itself from the trauma. The implication was clear. If she couldn't remember, how could the court prove what she was thinking? How could they prove intent if the defendant herself couldn't explain her actions? It was a compelling argument, one designed to introduce just enough doubt to avoid a murder conviction. But the prosecution wasn't buying it. They called their own medical expert, a neurologist who specialized in traumatic brain injuries. He acknowledged that memory loss was possible, even likely given the severity of the crash. But he also pointed out something crucial. Memory loss doesn't erase intent. It doesn't change what happened. Even if Mackenzie couldn't remember pressing the accelerator, the black box did. Even if she couldn't remember steering toward the wall, the surveillance footage did. Her amnesia, tragic as it might be, didn't make her less responsible. It just made it harder for her to defend herself. And in a case like this, where the physical evidence was so overwhelming, her inability to provide an alternative explanation only made her look more guilty. The issue of remorse became a flashpoint in the trial. The prosecution highlighted moments where Mackenzie appeared detached or unemotional. They pointed to her behavior in early court hearings, where she seemed more concerned with her own comfort than with the deaths of Dominic and Davian. They noted that in all the hours of police interviews, hospital conversations, and courtroom appearances, she had never once directly apologized to the families. She'd cried, yes, she'd said she wished it hadn't happened, but she'd never taken responsibility, never looked Dominic's mother in the eye and said, "I'm sorry I killed your son." That absence, the prosecution argued, spoke volumes. It showed a girl who saw herself as the victim, not the perpetrator. A girl who believed she deserved sympathy, not punishment. And that mindset, they argued, was exactly what made her dangerous. The defense countered that trauma manifests in different ways. That shock can make people seem cold or detached when they're actually just shutting down emotionally to survive. They argued that demanding a specific type of grief or remorse from a teenager with brain trauma was unfair and unrealistic. They painted Mackenzie as a girl overwhelmed by guilt, medication, and fear, unable to process or express her emotions in the way society expected. But the damage was done. The perception had been set. And as the final witnesses stepped down and both sides prepared for closing arguments, the question hanging over the courtroom was no longer whether Mackenzie had caused the crash. It was whether she'd done it on purpose, and if the words she'd spoken, the messages she'd sent, and the route she'd tested all pointed to one answer: yes. Closing arguments are where cases are won and lost. It's the moment when attorneys distill weeks or months of testimony into a single, cohesive narrative. It's persuasion at its highest level. And in Mackenzie Sharilla's trial, both sides knew this was their last chance to sway Judge Russo. The defense went first, and Mackenzie's attorney stood with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He spoke passionately about the tragedy of the case, emphasizing that 3 young lives had been destroyed that morning, not just 2. He reminded the court that Mackenzie was 17, that she had no prior history of violence, that she herself had been catastrophically injured and would live with the physical and emotional scars forever. He urged the judge to consider the possibility, however remote, that this was a terrible accident born of panic, a confusion, or a medical episode. He acknowledged the pain of the victims' families, but insisted that adding another life to the list of ruined futures would not bring justice. It would only compound the tragedy. The defense systematically went through alternative explanations. Could Mackenzie have had a seizure? Could Dominic have grabbed the wheel, causing her to panic and hit the gas instead of the brake? Could there have been a mechanical issue the investigators missed? Could she have blacked out, her foot frozen on the accelerator with no conscious awareness of what was happening? Each scenario was presented not as definitive truth, but as reasonable doubt. That's all the defense needed. Not to prove innocence, but to create enough uncertainty that the judge couldn't convict beyond a reasonable doubt. The attorney's voice rose with emotion as he concluded, "Your Honor, we will never know exactly what happened in those final seconds. But in the absence of certainty, in the presence of doubt, the law requires acquittal. This young girl deserves that chance." Then it was the prosecution's turn, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted immediately. The lead prosecutor stood, calm and composed, and began to walk through the evidence piece by piece. He started with the test run footage. Why was Mackenzie on that road 2 days before the crash? Why did she drive slowly down it, pause at the wall, and then leave? He didn't need to speculate. The pattern spoke for itself. Then he moved to the threats. Multiple witnesses testified that Mackenzie had talked about crashing her car, about ending it all, about making sure Dominic couldn't leave her. Were those just empty words, or were they confessions? The prosecutor let the question hang in the air before moving on. He turned to the surveillance footage from July 31st. He replayed it one more time, the video everyone in the courtroom had already seen, but somehow still couldn't look away from. The slow approach, the pause, the sudden, relentless acceleration, the lack of braking, the straight path directly into a brick wall. The prosecutor narrated as the video played, "This is not a driver losing control. This is not someone in a panic. This is someone making a choice. Watch the speed climb. Watch the trajectory stay straight. Watch as she never, not once, touches the brake. This is purpose, Your Honor. This is intent." When the video froze on the moment of impact, the prosecutor turned to the judge and said simply, "The car doesn't lie, the black box doesn't lie, and neither does this footage." He addressed the defense's theories one by one, methodically dismantling them. A seizure? No medical history, no evidence. Pedal confusion? She'd been driving for years, and the car was her own. Dominic grabbing the wheel? No evidence, no witnesses, and it wouldn't explain why she didn't brake. Mechanical failure? Every system in the car checked out. The prosecutor's tone was measured but firm. "Your Honor, the defense wants you to believe in a series of coincidences so unlikely, so implausible, that accepting them would require ignoring all the evidence in front of you. The simpler explanation, the one supported by facts, is that Mackenzie Shirilla did exactly what she said she would do. She used her car as a weapon. She killed Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan, and she needs to be held accountable." As the prosecutor delivered his final words, he shifted focus to the victims. He showed photos of Dominic and Davian, smiling, alive, full of potential. He spoke about Dominic's love for his family, his loyalty to his friends. He spoke about Davian's humor, his kindness, the fact that he had nothing to do with the relationship drama that cost him his life. These were real people, Your Honor, not just names in a case file. They had futures, they had dreams, and Mackenzie Shirilla took all of that away. The evidence is overwhelming. The intent is clear. Justice demands a guilty verdict. The courtroom was silent as he sat down. The weight of his words settled over everyone like a blanket, and all eyes turned to Mackenzie. On her reaction to the closing arguments was perhaps the most telling moment of the entire trial. Throughout the defense's argument, she had sat quietly, occasionally wiping her eyes. But when the prosecution replayed the surveillance footage, when the black box data scrolled across the screen again, when the photos of Dominic and Davian appeared larger than life on the monitors, something broke. Her composure, so carefully maintained throughout the trial, finally cracked. She began to cry openly, shoulders shaking, face buried in her hands. Whether it was genuine remorse or the realization that she was about to be convicted, no one could say for certain. But the girl who had walked into court looking confident, who had sat through weeks of testimony with relative calm, was finally showing the fear she'd been hiding all along. Our Judge Russo thanked both sides for their arguments and explained that she would take time to review the evidence and render her verdict. She emphasized that her decision would be based solely on the facts and the law, not on emotion or public opinion. She set a date for the verdict, August 14, 2023. The courtroom emptied slowly, families on both sides emotionally exhausted, reporters rushing to file their stories, and Mackenzie led back to her cell to wait. The days between closing arguments and the verdict were agonizing for everyone involved. Dominic's and Davian's families prayed for justice. Mackenzie's family prayed for mercy. And across the community, people debated what the outcome should be, but ultimately, it didn't matter what anyone thought. The only opinion that counted was Judge Russo's. And she was about to deliver it. August 14, 2023. Verdict Day. The courtroom filled even earlier than usual, people lining up outside before dawn to secure a seat. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. Over a year since the crash, months of investigation, weeks of trial. And now, finally, an answer. Dominic's family arrived wearing buttons with his photo on them. Davian's family wore shirts bearing his face and the words, "Justice for Davon." They took their seats behind the prosecution table, holding hands, bracing themselves for whatever was about to come. Across the aisle, Mackenzie's family sat in quiet anguish. Her mother looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her father stared straight ahead, jaw set, trying to maintain composure. And then Mackenzie was led in, wearing a blouse and dress pants, hair neatly styled, but eyes red and swollen. She knew. Everyone knew. This was it. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo entered, and the room stood as one. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted her glasses, and looked out over the courtroom. Her expression was unreadable, calm and professional, but there was a gravity to her presence that made everyone hold their breath. She began by acknowledging the difficulty of the case, the tragedy, the loss, the fact that no verdict could ever truly bring back Dominic and Davian or heal the wounds their deaths had left. But she also emphasized that her role was not to heal. It was to apply the law to the facts, to determine, based on the evidence presented, whether the state had proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Mackenzie Shirilla had committed murder. And after careful consideration of every piece of testimony, every video, every data point, she had reached a decision. Judge Russo began to lay out her reasoning, and with each sentence, the tension in the room grew. She discussed the surveillance footage, both from July 31st and the test run 2 days earlier. She noted the black box data, full throttle, zero braking, a straight trajectory maintained over hundreds of feet. She addressed the defense's alternative theories, acknowledging them but ultimately finding them unsupported by the evidence. There was no indication of mechanical failure, no evidence of a medical episode, no witness to corroborate interference from a passenger. What the evidence did show, she said, was a pattern of behavior, threats made, a route tested, and then, on the morning of July 31st, a deliberate act carried out with deadly precision. Her words were measured, but the conclusion was becoming clear. And Mackenzie began to tremble. Judge Russo spoke about the concept of purpose. In Ohio law, to prove murder, the state must show that the defendant acted with purpose to cause death. Purpose doesn't require a detailed plan or a confession. It can be inferred from the circumstances, from the actions taken, from the choices made. And in this case, the judge said, the actions spoke louder than any words could. Mackenzie chose to drive to that isolated road, chose to accelerate to 100 miles per hour, chose not to brake, chose to steer directly into a solid brick wall. Those were choices, conscious, deliberate choices. And the natural and probable consequence of those choices was death. That, Judge Russo said, was purpose. That was intent. And that was murder. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Our Judge Russo began to read the verdicts, count by count. On the charge of murder in the death of Davion Flanagan, I find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom. Dominic's mother let out a sob, a sound of relief and grief mixed together. Davion's family clutched each other, tears streaming down their faces. Mackenzie's mother gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. And Mackenzie herself sat frozen, staring at the judge as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Judge Russo continued. On the charge of murder in the death of Dominic Russo, I find the defendant guilty. Another wave of emotion swept through the room. More sobs, more tears. The judge went through the remaining counts: aggravated vehicular homicide, felonious assault, finding Mackenzie guilty on every single one. Mackenzie broke. She collapsed forward, head in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Her attorney put a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer some small comfort, but there was nothing left to say. The verdicts had been delivered. The evidence had been too strong. The actions too deliberate. And now Mackenzie Shirilla, at just 18 years old, was a convicted double murderer. Her mother wept openly in the gallery, her father holding her as his own tears fell. It was a scene of complete devastation on both sides. No one was celebrating. The families of Dominic and Davion felt a sense of justice, yes, but it was a hollow victory. Their sons were still gone, and no verdict could bring them back. Judge Russo allowed a moment for the emotion to settle before continuing. She addressed Mackenzie directly, her voice firm but not unkind. She spoke about the weight of decisions, about how every choice we make ripples outward, affecting not just ourselves, but everyone around us. She acknowledged Mackenzie's youth, but made it clear that youth was not an excuse for murder. You took 2 lives, the judge said. 2 young men who trusted you, who got into that car believing they were safe, and you betrayed that trust in the most final, irreversible way possible. She noted that while Mackenzie might not have intended to survive the crash herself, the fact remained that she did. And now she would have to live with what she had done. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of crying. Mackenzie couldn't look up, couldn't face the judge or the families or even her own parents. She just sat there, broken, as the reality of the rest of her life crashed down on her. Our Judge Russo announced that sentencing would be scheduled for a later date, giving both sides time to prepare victim impact statements and sentencing arguments. But everyone knew what was coming. With guilty verdicts on 2 counts of murder, Mackenzie was facing decades in prison, possibly life. The girl who had once thought she'd walk out of that courtroom free was now facing the very real possibility that she would never truly be free again. And as deputies moved forward to escort her out, she looked back at her parents one last time, mouthing the words, "I'm sorry." Whether she was apologizing for the murders or just for getting caught, no one would ever really know. Sentencing day carried a different kind of weight. The guilt had been established, the verdicts delivered. Now, and the only question left was how long Mackenzie Shirilla would spend behind bars. The courtroom filled once again, but this time it felt more like a memorial than a trial. The families of Dominic and Davion brought more than just their grief. They brought photos, framed pictures of the young men at graduations, at family gatherings, smiling and alive. They brought letters, they brought memories, and they brought the determination to make sure the judge understood exactly what had been taken from them. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about giving voice to the dead, about making sure Dominic and Davian were seen as more than just victims in a case file. Dominic's mother was the first to speak, and the courtroom felt her pain in every word. She stood at the podium, hands shaking, clutching a photo of her son. She talked about the day he was born, how he'd been her whole world from the moment she first held him. She described his personality, his protectiveness, his humor, the way he'd call her just to check in. She talked about the hole his death had left in their family, how holidays would never be the same, how she still expected him to walk through the door every time she heard a car pull up outside. Her voice broke as she described the moment the police told her he was gone. "I begged them to tell me he was in jail," she said. "I would have taken that. Anything but this." She turned to look at Mackenzie, and her voice hardened. "You took my son from me. You killed him, and I will never forgive you." Davian's family spoke next, and their pain was compounded by the senselessness of his death. He hadn't been part of the relationship drama. He was just a friend, caught in the wrong place at the worst possible time. His mother described him as her baby, her light, the son who always made her laugh. She talked about his future, the plans he'd had, the life he was supposed to live. "He didn't deserve this," she said, tears streaming down her face. "He trusted her. He got in that car thinking he was safe, and she killed him for no reason. He was innocent, and now he's gone." The weight of that innocence, the randomness of his death, made it somehow even more tragic. Dominic had at least been part of the toxic relationship. But Davian? He was collateral damage, and his family would carry that injustice forever. The defense made one final plea for leniency. Mackenzie's attorney stood and asked the court to consider her age, her lack of prior criminal record, and her own injuries. He talked about the traumatic brain injury, the physical scars, the fact that she would carry the guilt of this for the rest of her life. He argued that while accountability was necessary, there was also room for mercy. She was 18 now, barely an adult. Locking her away for life would accomplish nothing but adding another destroyed life to the count. He asked Judge Russo to consider a sentence that offered the possibility of redemption, of rehabilitation, of someday allowing Mackenzie a chance to atone and move forward. It was an emotional appeal, delivered with genuine conviction, but it was also a long shot. The evidence had been too damning, the verdicts too clear. Then Mackenzie herself was given the opportunity to speak. She stood slowly, her hands shaking, and approached the podium. She looked pale, smaller somehow than she had during the trial. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she began. She said she was sorry. She said she wished she could take it all back. She addressed the families directly, though she struggled to make eye contact, and said she never meant for anyone to die. Whether anyone believed her was unclear. Her words felt hollow against the weight of the evidence, against the black box data and the surveillance footage and the test run. But she said them anyway, because what else was there left to say? She apologized to her own family for the pain she'd caused them. And then she sat back down, tears streaming down her face, waiting for the sentence that would define the rest of her life. Judge Russo took her time before speaking. She reviewed the nature of the crimes, the devastating impact on the victims' families, and the severity of using a vehicle as a weapon of murder. She acknowledged Mackenzie's youth, but also emphasized that young people are capable of making catastrophic, life-altering decisions. She spoke about accountability, about the need for justice, not just for the victims, but for society as a whole. And then she delivered the sentence, life in prison, with eligibility for parole after 15 years. It was a heavy sentence, but not the absolute maximum. It offered a sliver of hope, distant and uncertain, but there nonetheless. Mackenzie would be in her early 30s before she could even apply for parole, and there was no guarantee she'd ever be released. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate and mixed. Dominic's and Davian's families felt a sense of justice, though it was tempered by the reality that no sentence could bring their sons back. 15 years felt like a long time, but it also felt like not enough. How do you quantify the value of a life? How do you punish someone adequately for taking two? Mackenzie's family, meanwhile, was devastated. Her mother sobbed uncontrollably. Her father sat in stunned silence. 15 years to life. Their daughter, their little girl, would spend the prime of her life behind bars. And even if she was eventually paroled, she would carry the label of convicted murderer for the rest of her days. No matter how much time passed, this would define her. Mackenzie was led away in handcuffs, and the courtroom slowly emptied. Outside, reporters swarmed both families, asking for reactions, for statements, for any final words. Some obliged. Others just shook their heads and walked away, too emotionally exhausted to speak. As the news spread, social media exploded with opinions. Some people felt the sentence was fair, a balance between punishment and the recognition of her youth. Others felt it was too lenient, that someone who deliberately killed two people deserved to die in prison. Still others argued it was too harsh, that a broken teenager with mental health issues needed treatment, not decades behind bars. The debate would continue long after the courthouse doors closed, but for the families involved, the legal chapter was over. The emotional one would last forever. In the end, the Mackenzie-Sherilla case leaves us with more questions than answers, even after the verdicts and the sentencing. Legally, the matter is settled. A judge looked at the evidence and concluded that Mackenzie intentionally used her car as a weapon to kill Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan. The black box data, the surveillance footage, the test run, the threatening statements, all of it combined to paint a picture of premeditation and purpose. But morally, emotionally, the questions linger. Was this truly a calculated act of murder by a cold, manipulative teenager? Or was it the tragic culmination of untreated mental illness, toxic relationships, and a teenage brain not fully capable of understanding consequences? The answer probably lies somewhere in the uncomfortable middle, a place where both things can be true at once. What's undeniable is the loss. Two young men are gone. Dominic Russo, 20 years old with his whole life ahead of him. Davian Flanagan, 19, in an innocent bystander who trusted the wrong person on the wrong morning. Their families will never get them back. No verdict, no sentence, no amount of justice can undo that. They will spend the rest of their lives navigating holidays without their sons, answering questions about how many children they have, and having to decide whether to mention the ones who are gone. The grief doesn't end, it just changes shape. And for Dominic's and Davian's families, that grief will be a lifelong companion, a weight they'll carry every single day. But there's loss on the other side, too. Mackenzie-Sherilla's family has also been destroyed by this case. They've lost their daughter, not to death, but to prison, which in some ways is its own kind of death. She'll spend her 20s behind bars. She'll miss milestones, celebrations, the simple act of living a normal life. And when she eventually gets out, if she gets out, she'll be a middle-aged woman with a murder conviction and a lifetime of judgment ahead of her. Her name will always be associated with this case. She'll never escape it. Whether that's justice or tragedy depends on your perspective. But either way, it's a loss. Another life fundamentally altered, if not entirely destroyed, by the events of that July morning. The public reaction to the case has been deeply divided, and that division reflects larger societal debates about crime, punishment, mental health, and youth. Some people see Mackenzie as a monster, a cold-blooded killer who deserves every year of her sentence and more. They point to her behavior in court, her apparent lack of remorse, the premeditation evidenced by the test run. They argue that her age is irrelevant, that 17 is old enough to know that driving into a wall at 100 miles per hour will kill everyone in the car. They want accountability. They want punishment, and they believe the system delivered exactly what it should have. For them, this case is about justice, plain and simple. Others see Mackenzie as a cautionary tale about untreated mental illness and the failures of the systems meant to protect vulnerable young people. They point to her emotional instability, her history of making threats she didn't follow through on, her desperate pleas for help that were dismissed as teenage drama. They argue that the brain of a 17-year-old is not fully developed, particularly the parts responsible for impulse control and long-term thinking. They wonder if this could have been prevented with better mental health intervention, with adults who took her threats seriously, with a society that doesn't romanticize toxic relationships. For them, this case is a tragedy on all sides, and adding another life to the body count doesn't feel like justice. It feels like compounding the loss. The legal questions are settled, but the moral ones remain open. Can a 17-year-old truly commit premeditated murder in the same way an adult can? Should the justice system treat teenage offenders the same as adults when the crime is this severe? Is 15 years to life an appropriate sentence for someone whose brain wasn't fully developed when the crime occurred? These are questions without easy answers, and they reflect deep philosophical divides about responsibility, punishment, and redemption. The Mackenzie-Shirilla case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths: that teenagers can be dangerous, that mental illness is not an excuse, but also not irrelevant, and that sometimes there are no good outcomes, only terrible ones and slightly less terrible ones. What remains beyond the legal arguments and the public debates are the human beings at the center of this story. Dominic Russo is remembered by his family as loving, loyal, and full of life. They share stories about him, post photos on his birthday, and keep his memory alive in the ways they can. Davian Flanagan is remembered as funny, kind, and tragically innocent. His family does the same, ensuring that he's more than just a name in a court transcript. They were real people. They had dreams. They had futures, and those futures were stolen. And that's the one fact in this case that no one disputes. Everything else, the intent, the motive, the appropriate punishment, can be debated endlessly. But the loss is absolute and permanent. Mackenzie-Shirilla will spend at least the next 15 years in prison, and possibly much longer. She'll have time to reflect, to grow, to grapple with what she did. Whether she uses that time for genuine rehabilitation or simply serves it as punishment is up to her. Whether society will ever see her as anything other than a killer is an open question. And whether she truly intended to murder Dominic and Davian, or whether this was a moment of catastrophic emotional breakdown, is something only she can ever really know. The courts have decided, the families have spoken, and now all that's left is time. Time for grief, time for healing, not if that's even possible, and time for Mackenzie to sit in a cell and live with the consequences of the choice she made on a quiet July morning when she pressed the accelerator and never touched the brake. The case closes with an image that will haunt everyone who followed it: a silver car, a brick wall, and 19 seconds of footage that told a story words never could. In an age of filters, curated personas, and carefully constructed narratives, the one thing that couldn't be manipulated was the camera mounted on that warehouse corner. It didn't care about excuses. It didn't care about intentions. It just recorded what happened. And what happened was clear, undeniable, and devastating. 2 young men died because someone chose violence over walking away. Whether you call that murder or tragedy, accident or intent, the result is the same. Dominic and Davian are gone. Mackenzie is in prison, and 3 families are left to pick up pieces that will never quite fit back together. Justice was served in the legal sense, but in the human sense, there are no winners here. Only loss, grief, and the echoing question: could any of this have been prevented? And if so, how do we make sure it never happens again?